Grace and peace to everybody here. It is a joy to see all of your faces. It has been too long for some of you. Since Friday almost. It's been 2 days. You know, sometimes I think back to some of the sermons I've listened to in my life, and there are a couple, I bet all of you have a few sermons that stick out to you the most, that when you're walking through life, your mind constantly drifts back to them. And one of my top 5 favorite sermons delivered, it was somewhere around here in 2015. Where did you preach the book of Numbers? What is it? It was in this room. And I have listened to this sermon upwards of 5 to 10 times, and I try to picture when it was given, but I wasn't around. But in it, Brother Finney, he gives a sermon titled Transformation from a Life of Defeat to a Life of Victory. And it's from Numbers 21. And it's a story about Moses when he has this serpent on this stick. And Brother Finney does a great job of personifying the enemy as a serpent, a snake. How many of you in here like snakes? Harry, Brother Harry, Bryant, you like snakes? So I think that when we read through the Bible, snakes are one of these things that they should kind of give us this hair on our neck kind of feeling that this is an enemy. This is something that wants to devour us. We have a very real enemy who is seeking after our lives, who wants our souls. And as we leave our homes every morning, do we really tap into that? So I want to remind you that when you personify the enemy, it might not be snakes, but think of the worst thing you could possibly think of in your life and put that face on Satan. Personify him as hard as you can. And in the Bible, it does a great job of doing this with snakes. So I want to take a little bit of time to set the stage for 1 Samuel 15 by looking at 4 short passages in Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, and 1 in 1 Samuel. So you don't have to turn with me, but I'm going to be reading through those. So in Genesis 3:15, I was spending some time a couple weeks ago with our local Hebrew expert here, and he was walking me through this narrative of serpents. And God is talking to the enemy of a serpent, and he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your heel, and you shall bruise he shall bruise your head, and you should bruise his heel. So in Genesis 3:15, the battle begins, the cosmic battle that we are endeavoring in. And it's hard to frame it. Sometimes we always forget this. But Genesis 3:15, the battle of the serpent as our enemy begins. He begins placing a strategy to defeat us, placing a strategy to undo our work. God's people, they go out and they face the enemy in various forms. And one of the forms the enemy takes on is in the people called the Amalekites. So today I want to pay special attention to the Amalekites and look over the history of the Amalekites with the people of Israel. So the next passage we're going to turn to is Exodus 17, 8 through 6. Thanks, brother. I'm a little sick here, so pardon my voice. All right. So Exodus 17, 8 through 16. The heading of the story in my Bible is Victory over the Amalekites. Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim, and Moses said to Joshua, choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of a hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And so it was, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, and supported his hands. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under the heaven." And Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, "Because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." So previously we see that the serpent enters the life of the Israelites. And then here we see it again, that Amalek is going to come in. And this isn't a question, this is a promise. Every generation is going to face war with the enemy. Every single generation, he is not going to go away. And something else we learn about the Amalekites in Deuteronomy. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 25, 17 to 19. So this is Deuteronomy 25, 17 to 19. And Moses says, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear, when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around, and the land which your Lord God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget." You shall not forget. So lastly, we get this picture of a serpent. What do we learn about our enemy? Does he attack us at our strong points, or does he attack us at our weak points? Weak points. The Amalekites were like guerrilla fighters. They're going after the weak and the children, the ones who aren't strong enough to stand up. So we learn that our enemy is like a serpent, and we will have war with him for every generation. And not only that, our enemy he's smart. He's going for us where we don't want him to go for us. He's going for us at our weak points. And then the last passage I want to read before starting in 1 Samuel is just a reminder of where we are in 1 Samuel. Was when Saul was anointed king over Israel in chapter 11, we see him fight a man named Nahash, the Ammonite, not the Amalekite, an Ammonite. But what does the word Nahash mean in Hebrew? Snake. Okay, so we get this picture of Saul, and he has a ton of promise. Saul mobilizes the Israelites against Nahash, and all of a sudden, I didn't even catch this when I was reading. I don't speak Hebrew, but we see a lot of hope. We see a lot of hope in Saul as the crusher of the serpent, the one who is going to rally the Israelites and defeat the enemy. And today, we're gonna study a little bit about how Saul went from a man of great promise to one who crushes serpents to one who charms them, one who lets them into the ranks of the Israelites, one who forgets what the call is. So everybody, open up to the book of 1 Samuel, and we're going to read from chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Saul spares King Agag. And I want you to remember what the Lord, who remembers what the Lord said to the Israelites about when the Amalekites come out? What were they supposed to do to the Amalekites? Blot them out from under the heaven. Right. All right. Samuel also said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel. Now he ambushed him on the way when he had came from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them. but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt." So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites, and Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings and lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, "I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me, and has not performed my commandments." And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel saying, "Saul went up to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument for himself, and he has gone on round, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal." Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears, and the lowing of oxen which I hear?" And Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed." Then Samuel said to Saul, "Be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night." And he said to him, "Speak on." So Samuel said, "When were you little in your own eyes? Were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" And Saul said to Samuel, "But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king." Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me, that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to Saul, "I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." And as Samuel turned around to go away, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. So Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And also the strength of Israel will not lie or relent, for he is not a man that he should relent." Then he said, "I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me." So Agag came to him cautiously. And Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made woman childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Wow. What, what a story we have here. I don't know if all of you followed along or caught it. Basically, after reading through the initial story of the Amalekites, God is finally handing the king to Israel on a silver platter. He's saying, it's time. I told you not to forget. I told you the enemy is here. When that time comes, you have to blot them off from under the heaven. And he would not forget. But what happened here? So Saul, he gets a little complacent, he gets a little fatigued, and he forgets that partial obedience is not obedience at all. He lets the enemy, like a serpent, creep into his life and whisper things in his mind. And that partial obedience allows for that. We are always in a cosmic battle with a very, very real enemy. It is literal. It is something that is hard to keep in our minds, but it's real. It's real life. A snake wants to coil around you and squeeze the life out of you so that when we die, he may have our soul. The analogy, I've always thought about this. The analogy of a cosmic battle is useful for me because all of us understand and have heard stories about war, and we understand the struggles and we understand the sacrifices. But how many of us, have any of you here experienced battle, real life battle? Yeah, I haven't. So I've always thought about this. How can we make this analogy better in our mind? So I'm going to try to draw upon a great game that simulates a battle, and I know that some of us will be more familiar with. Capture the Flag. How many of us in here have played Capture the Flag? Most of us. Okay, great. So a lot of you are familiar with Capture the Flag. We have two teams. Each team has a great objective to capture the flag of the opposing team, and the enemy is going to try to sneak in and capture your own flag. Each side, when you strategize together, you have an offense and a defense. An offense and a defense. And many of you know that we as a church here, we live in intentional community, and we have partaken in Capture the Flag. So I'm going to tell a story. How many of you know what story I'm going to tell? Oh, you know what story I'm going to tell. So we were playing Capture the Flag, and we divided into teams, and each person selected their team. And what I want all of us to know is the enemy, when I'm trying to think about this battle, the enemy is trying to sneak in. He's trying to grab your flag, but you have to defend it. So Brother Finney, he may look really innocent to most of you, but I was on the opposing team as Brother Finney, and it was dark out. It was really dark, and it was kind of hard to tell what was going on, but all of a sudden there was this car that was driving on the road through our territory, and I watched my teammates in front of me, and all of them were like, oh, the minivan, it's just going anywhere. And I was the last line of defense. I was the one that was protecting our flag. And I looked into the window and I saw these conniving eyes of Brother Finney driving the minivan. And he had made it past the line of defenses. He had made it past my teammates. He had made it past everyone into our lives, into our territory, and he was out to get us. He was out for our flag. He deceived the entire line in front of him. They had no idea. But I knew better. I knew much better than to trust a serpent when I see one. And so I ran after him as hard as I could, and he put his foot on the gas pedal of that minivan, and the door was open, and I was being dragged by the car, and I got in, and I captured him, and I captured his little minion that was with him. They were out for my flag. and I put them in the prison. I put them in the prison of Capture the Flag. Is everyone familiar with the rules? Once you capture the enemy, you're allowed to put them in a prison. And in my mind, I was thinking, this is great. My team is a step up. I've captured him, and we're on the move. We have a leg up. Many times in life, when we look at this story and we think about the enemy, he does not present himself as a serpent to us. He presents himself as a disguise, someone wearing camouflage. Many people have said the devil wears camouflage. The devil tries to get in the side of a family vehicle, a minivan, and deceive everybody. But there's a stark reality that what seems innocent can destroy you. What seems innocent can destroy each of us. The little things in our life can make an incredibly big difference. Unfortunately, many of us are blind to this reality and will be deceived by the enemy. And we must never, ever let this happen. We must never let this happen. There's a story that has also been told around many campfires for years about a woman who had pet snakes, and she liked to sleep with her snake in her bed. It's kind of just, Harry, would you do that? I hope not. You don't like snakes that bad. So I'm going to read this story. There once was a woman who had a pet snake that she loved very much. The snake was about 7 feet long, and one day it just stopped eating. After several weeks of trying everything she could to get the snake to eat, the woman took it to the vet. The woman explained the situation to the vet, and he asked her, "Has your snake been sleeping with you at night or snuggling really close and stretching himself out?" The woman replied, "Yes, he's been doing it every day, and it makes me so sad that I can't make him feel better." The vet says, "Ma'am, your snake is not sick. He's been preparing to eat you. He's been sizing you up every day so he knows how big he has to be, and not eating so he has enough room to digest you." So what is the moral of this story that we see here? You have to recognize that there are snakes out there. And just because they seem close to you, just because they seem innocent and they sleep next to you and they're not hurting you, it doesn't mean that their intentions are good, and it doesn't mean that you're safe. This is a great reality that we have to wake up to if we're going to make war against the enemy, if we're going to strategize together and discover the tactics of the enemy. So today, we're going to be studying one of the great tactics of our enemy. And the great tactics of our enemy is to get us to let down our defenses in the form of partial obedience. The enemy loves when we question God and we say, "Did God really say X? Did God really say Y? Don't these things change over time?" The enemy is making his way into your bed. The minivan is coming to get your flag. And what if you don't train and study the tactics of the enemy? We are going to be defeated. So I want us to study the art of crushing this partial obedience for Christ and the victory that the church will have in the end against our great enemy. The enemy is after your flag. Never, ever forget this. Never. And over time, how many of you in the middle of Capture Flag have felt a little fatigued and you just said, "I can't wait until this is over"? How many of you in life have felt a little fatigued that the enemy is constantly attacking you, constantly going for you? And we must not let our fatigue break us. We must turn to each other, and the only way to fight our enemy is with the help of others and the discipline that comes from the rally cry of our team in the beginning of the game. So we read 1 Samuel 15, and we learned a little bit about this great battle that the Israelites were facing. And it's it's fitting to incorporate some lessons from military strategy when we're telling this story. Many of you know that I went to a military academy, and one of the core classes, one of the classes all the students had to take, was a class called Military and Strategic Studies, and we had to read a book called The Art of War, written by a famous Chinese military leader, and his name was Sun Tzu. Has anyone ever heard of Sun Tzu? And Sun Tzu, he was a Chinese general, a military strategic thinker, and a philosopher who lived in the eastern part of China. And Sun Tzu is traditionally credited as the author of this book called The Art of War. And his work is really widely influential, and it's affected a lot of our strategic thought. And aside from his legacy as the author of this book called The Art of War, he's also just a legendary historic figure. That's why we all had to read him. And one of my favorite quotes that has always stuck with me, we had to memorize this, it's a quote from The Art of War, and it says this: "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." I'm just going to read the first line one more time. "If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." So today we're going to do exactly that. We're going to be studying the enemy, and we're going to be studying ourselves so that we need not fear the result of the 100 battles. So the first point I want to make is about ourselves. What do we learn about ourselves as a people when we read about this story of the Amalekites? And it's a simple point, but over time, fatigue and blind spots are introduced into our lives. None of us are immune to fatigue and blind spots. If we read through 1 Samuel chapter 15, in the dialogue that Saul is having with the Israelites, we see that Saul, when he faced Nahash, he was a serpent killer. We saw him mobilize. We saw him listen to God's word. We saw him fight with the people. We saw a lot of promise. And right in chapter 15, we see him become a serpent charmer. We see him face the Amalekite king and say, you look pretty good. I don't have to fight against you. And he invites him into his territory with him, among his people. And because all of us will become fatigued and we will have blind spots, what is the implication if we have blind spots? If we have blind spots, we cannot go through life alone. If we do not surround ourselves with a line of defense that is guarding our soul, guarding our obedience, that the enemy is going to get to us. It's basically not even a question. We need help and discipline. So did you catch verse 12? So let's read verse 12 here. I'm in the book of Joshua here. Okay. Verse 12. So Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul. It was told to Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel. Indeed, he set up a monument for himself. And he had gone around, passed by, down Gilgal. So here was Samuel, mourning for Saul, mourning as his last time, the last line of defense. If we don't set up a line of defense in our lives, it's a surefire way that when the enemy comes in and he attacks you, that he is going to have your flag. So like Samuel, like Saul had Samuel, we need this line of defense in our lives. And what is it that Samuel does for Saul when he realizes that he is in partial disobedience? Did anyone catch that? Did Samuel give Saul a lot of advice? No. Did Samuel immediately, did he give Saul a book to read? No, he didn't. Malcolm, what did Samuel do for Saul?
Cried out to the Lord all night.
He cried out to the Lord all night, and he mourned for him. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. When a brother comes to you with a problem, or a sister, what is your first response? Many times I believe that our first response is not the right one. Many times my first instinct when someone comes to me with a problem is to give them advice, off-the-cuff advice from some experience that I have. But really, our first instinct to drop down to the Lord in prayer and mourn for people in their situation, mourn for people in their fatigue. We need more of this in our lives when we see brothers and sisters that are wrestling, that are in the danger, the snake is wrapping his body around their body. We need to mourn. We need to pray. We need to approach God in prayer. So, how do you combat fatigue? A lot of us have been spending a lot of time thinking about our habits and our rituals and the things that we will do all the time when we know that we're tired. And fatigue leads to blind spots, which leads to this partial disobedience. And one of the things that we must know about our enemy is that our enemy can survive and thrive under partial disobedience. Our enemy can survive and thrive in our partial disobedience. This is because the little things in life can make a big difference. Many people are familiar with the book of James. In James chapter 3, it says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in a word, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits into horses' mouths that they may obey us, and turn their whole body. Look at the ships. Although they are so large and driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how a great forest a little fire kindles, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among the members that it defiles the whole body, and sets on fire the course of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell." Over the course of my life, when I have confronted some of the harder teachings, many people will make arguments about the passages in the Bible, and they will say, it's not a big deal. Why are you worrying about this? Many of us have similar stories in our pasts where people don't want a complete obedience, and they justify it by saying it's not a big deal. Just live your life and keep going. A man named Leo Tolstoy has a great quote about this, and he says, "I know that most men, including those at ease with problems of the greatest complexity, can seldom accept even the simplest and most obvious truth if it would so much as oblige them to admit falsity of conclusions which they have delighted explaining to colleagues, which they had proudly taught to others, and which they have woven thread by thread into the fabric of their lives." And if I want any of you to remember one thing from today, it is that this partial disobedience that we see Saul partake in makes a big difference. So I want to spend some time convincing everyone that we have to rise to the challenge of crushing partial disobedience. In James chapter 2, verse 10, it also says that whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point, he is guilty of all. I want to think of some examples that drive this point across. Little things can make a big difference, and what seems really innocent can destroy you. And these little things, it's a point that Finney made in his other sermon, is our God of war. he requires complete annihilation of disobedience. He requires that we hack the temptation to pieces, that we allow no room for it in our lives, because there's not room for lawlessness in the kingdom of God. So let's take some look at this concept that little things make a big difference. In the city of New York, there's this big problem of crime. It was pretty rampant in the early 90s. And somebody got this brilliant idea, and they said, I think that there's a lot of crime because there's graffiti on the walls of the subway, that we are letting people get away with these small things. It's actually, and they also said, if people see broken windows, they're more likely to disobey at other times. So what they started doing is they did a citywide campaign to start painting over all the graffiti in the city, and they started fixing all the windows of some of the houses in some of the slums. And what do you think happened? The crime rates decreased. The crime rates decreased, and less people were going to jail, and the cops they thought to themselves, wow, it's actually these small areas in life that end up making a big difference. There's a story of some graffiti artists that they would go and graffiti and they would be really proud, and people would come with paint buckets and they'd paint right over it, right after they graffitied, and then they'd go back and forth. And then at the end, the people who were painting on the walls, they gave up. They were like, I can't win this battle. And the crime rate started decreasing. One of my dad's favorite stories to tell, he grew up on a farm, and his brother and him had this brilliant idea that they were going to go play in their barn in a haystack with candles and matches. So they went and they built a little fort in the hay, and they said, oh, this is great, we have a hay fort. And they were trying to light matches. Has anyone tried to light matches off your zippers and things like that? It seems really innocent. But what happened was one of the matches, got thrown into the hay, and it started a fire in the hay. And everyone knows how flammable is hay. One of the most flammable things. And my dad, he tells a story pretty intensely. He tried as hard as he could to put the fire out, but it was too late. One match set all the hay on fire, and it burned down his dad's whole barn, and they lost like a bunch of cattle, and my dad was sitting there outside. I think it's one of the more traumatizing moments in his life. And after that moment, he had trouble relating to my grandpa, because a small thing can make a huge difference. I'm going to drive this point one more time. When I was in 5th grade, I was chasing one of my friends around a friend's house, and I was chasing him, and there was this glass door, and he slammed the glass door as I was running after him, and the glass shattered all over me, and I was bleeding everywhere, and I dropped to my knees, and I was like, I thought I was going to die. It was everywhere, blood everywhere. So my friend's dad, he rushed me to the hospital, and do you know what the first thing they did in the hospital was? They x-rayed me for shards of glass that might have been traveling around in my veins. I don't know, I'm not a doctor, I know we have doctors. But ever since that moment, they didn't stitch up the gaping holes, because they knew that if a piece of glass had entered into my system, that it was going to wreak havoc on me. Like the city streets of New York, like matches in a haystack, partial disobedience will have a destructive force in our lives if we don't pay close attention to it. In Matthew chapter 7, this has been quoted many times in our circles, but Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, Have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. You know, in the story I told you about Capture the Flag, I thought I was doing really good, and I captured Finney. I captured your buddy Elisha, one of the Milioni boys, and I put them in our jail. And over the course of time, I forgot the rules, my role in the game, and I wandered off. And you know what happened? The enemy came in and freed them. I wasn't guarding him with everything I had, and he escaped, and all of a sudden the tides turned. It flipped instantly. Where I had forgotten about the rules of the game, the enemy creeped in, freed his workers, and I lost that game. I let down my guard because of my partial disobedience. The little things in life can make a big difference. So it is possible for the enemy to survive and thrive under our partial disobedience. So what is the logical conclusion to partial disobedience? What is the next step for us? It's actually, we must know this about ourselves. The only way back from partial disobedience is full obedience. All right. So many of you know that all of you have had weak points in your life. You've had weak points, we have had sins, and one of my favorite points from the sermon in Numbers is that where we were once weak, we can become strong. In the areas of our life where we suffered, where we had terrible fights with God, or not fights with God, wrestling with God, fights with temptation, that we can conquer this with obedience as the key to victory. But here in this story, we don't see that. We don't see Saul come around and conquer his struggle with obedience. So how does Saul try to recover from his partial disobedience? In verse 21 of 1 Samuel chapter 15, we see Saul say, but the people took the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So the first thing Saul tries to substitute obedience with is sacrifice. He says, look, I'm sorry for what I've done. We're sacrificing to the Lord. What else do you want me to do? But no, it doesn't work. What is Samuel's response in verse 22? So Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offering and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice. This is a great lesson that all of us must learn in life. The Lord does not want you to ask for forgiveness without your commitment to obedience. It doesn't go that way. This is a very farce version of repentance, and it carries itself well in the dialogue with Samuel. All right, so what does Saul do? What is the next substitute that Saul tries to throw in there? So let's look at verse 25. So then he says, now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. So the second substitute that Saul tries to insert in as a substitute for obedience is worship. How many of us, when we have been convicted of sin in our lives, walk into the altar, walk into God's house, and we sit there and we sing songs, and inside we just know we're not supposed to be there? Has any of you ever done that before? Where we drag ourselves in and we're not committing to obedience, but we're there singing worship. We're there crying before the Lord and we're singing to him without committing to obedience. Worship is also not a substitute for obedience. So what's another substitute that Saul tries to insert in? Yet another one. In verse 30 we see Saul say, then he said, I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me that I may worship the Lord, your God. So the next thing Saul tries to replace with obedience is what other people think of him. He says, all right, in my obedience, it's all going to be okay if everyone thinks that that I'm okay with God. So Saul says to Samuel, please come back with me. If you're with me, then everybody's going to look at me and they're going to think that everything's okay. And we learn three key things that people often try to substitute for obedience here. Forgiveness, or sacrifice in this case, worship, and what people think of us. Those are some of the three low-hanging fruits that are no substitute for obedience. Saul refuses to take ownership of the choice he has made. He refuses culpability. He refuses it. He points at other people. He says, no, it was them. It was the people. It wasn't me. It was them. It was them taking the sacrifice. Has anyone ever heard the saying, when you point a finger, how many are pointing back at you? 3. When you point a finger at somebody, 3 are pointing back at you. When our brothers who are in the line of defense, did I say something wrong? When our brothers who are in the line of defense call something out in our lives, we must listen to them. We must take responsibility. We must heed their warning. If not, we are in danger of shirking off the implications of partial obedience. So Saul, he refuses to take ownership here. And in his mind, the support of men becomes more important than reconciliation with God. So what is the true way back to obedience? We see this here in verse 33. And it's a haunting scene in the chapter, but Samuel says to King Agag, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. The only way to recover from partial disobedience is full obedience and to follow through with what the Lord has for us. Samuel here, he exhibits what I think is a perfect blend of mercy and meekness. Although Saul had committed the crime, Samuel has mercy on Saul, and he goes after the king. Does anyone remember one of the common errors of thinking about what meekness is? Many people confuse meekness with weakness. Samuel, up to this point, has been a very meek character. But what do we see in the moment when it matters most? We see Samuel's power behind his meekness. We see him take out the weapon and destroy the enemy when he needed to be destroyed. Isn't it interesting that when we are facing our greatest enemy, the Amalekites, that they cannot experience victory alone? Do you remember the story of Moses with Aaron and Hur by his side? What did Moses need? He needed support. He needed Aaron on his right side. He needed Hur on his left side. He needed them because they were going to fatigue. We cannot defeat the enemy by ourselves. Does Saul manage to do it by himself? No. Therefore, we learn another great point about our enemy and ourselves. Our enemy is no fool. He'll target our weaknesses, and we cannot defeat him by ourselves. In Deuteronomy, we learn that our enemy loves to fight a type of guerrilla warfare. I said this before. Does everyone know what guerrilla warfare is? Guerrilla warfare is a non-traditional type of warfare where you kind of hide in the bushes and you surprise your enemy when they're not expecting it. You surprise them at their weak spots. another form. Has any of you ever watched like safaris where cheetahs are chasing after the prey? They usually try to separate the young ones, and they go for the young, innocent buffalo or whatever it may be, and they attack them there. Like snakes, our enemy is going for our weaknesses. One time, I think some of you have heard me tell this story. I grew up in Ecuador, so I had the chance to go to the jungles, and I loved holding snakes. When you hold snakes, it's really fun to sort of see what they do. And one time, my brother-in-law was visiting, and we went to a place called Anaconda Island. Anaconda Island. What a great place to be. Not really. And I was holding, so what happened was, there was this great big old anaconda that was laying on the ground. And the snake trainer pulled him out and set him there. And the snake person, the tour guide, he gave me this tiny little baby snake, and he put it in my hands. And I was holding it, and it was kind of nerve-wracking because you see this big snake on the ground, you have this little one in your hands, and you're like, both of these can hurt me, I don't know how to handle this. So the little one tried to get out of my hand, and I squeezed it, and it latched on to my arm, and it bit me. And if anyone has not been bit by a snake, it's a weird feeling because it's really hard to believe that the snake isn't venomous when you don't really know anything about snakes. So I was sitting there thinking like, I think I'm going to die. But what's really interesting was I was bleeding, and the old anaconda on the ground, the snake trader watched it. He said, "What? Everybody," he took this as a teaching moment. He said, "Everybody watch this anaconda on the ground." And the anaconda became lively, and it started heading my direction, and its tongue was out. And he said, "He can smell your blood. He's coming for you." And I'm sitting here, I was in 4th grade, and I'm in 4th grade, and the anaconda was blind. It was incredible. And I would walk over to this way, and the anaconda's head would come over to me, and it could smell my blood. It knew that I was in a moment of weakness. Similarly, I was surrounded by my family. I was surrounded by a group of people, luckily, and they bandaged my arm, and the trainer threw the anaconda back in the cage, put them back in the cage. But we must know this about our enemy. I don't know how else to say it, that he will come for you in your moments of weakness. And our greatest defense against our enemy in our moments of weakness is what? Each other. Our greatest tool in our moments of weakness is each other. Are you submitted to a body of believers and saints, or are you in a no man's land? How many of you know what a no man's land is? A no man's land in Capture the Flag is a territory that neither you control nor the enemy controls, but if you're in it, you're in danger. If you're not submitted to a body, it's as if you're taking your flag and you're throwing it into no man's land, and you're saying, "Come get it. Come take it. I don't have anyone supporting me. I don't have anybody checking in with me." Have any of you ever been by yourself when the enemy is coming after your weaknesses? When you're not submitted to a body and you feel like it's the end of the world. I will tell you myself that for most of my young life, I was not submitted to a body. And when the enemy comes after you at your weak points, it's the worst feeling in the world because you know that you feel helpless. You feel like people can't speak into your life. And similarly, when we think back upon our past and our partial disobedience, we should shudder. We should shudder at the past. Brother Finney tells, I hope that all of you will go listen to his sermon as well, but he tells a story about his past and just shuddering at the decisions that he made in the past, and I do the same. I was a senior and I was in high school, and I made a decision that went against my deepest conviction. It should have got me expelled from school. It should have ruined my life. And I was sitting there. I'll never forget this. I was in my room, and I felt the most alone I had ever been in my whole life. And I was contemplating running away. I was contemplating, I didn't know what to do. I honestly didn't. So in my moment of weakness, the enemy was coming for me. I knew, I could feel it. And the only thing I knew what to do was pray. I didn't know, I didn't have anybody. I didn't have anyone to go to. I didn't have anyone I could trust. So I called my oldest sister. And she was in Minnesota, and I said, please help. I need your help. I've made a huge error. And she said, I'm buying a ticket. She said, I'm buying a ticket. I'm coming down to see you. And in that moment, I felt this complete freedom that I'm not alone. The enemy, I don't have to face the enemy alone. I don't have to be weak in front of him. One of my favorite points about that sermon in Numbers is, in our weakness, we can be made strong. And the people around us who we care about, they want you to win. Like Aaron, like Hur with Moses. They want you to defeat the Amalekites. They want you to defeat the Amalekites. And I'm begging you, many of you are brothers in the church with me. I'm begging you that as kin, please look out for me. Please look out for me in my life as I go on. And please be my eyes where I have blind spots. And in return, I will give my utmost to be your eyes. I will be my utmost to hold you up when the enemy is coming to dismantle you. Don't be deceived in thinking that this meeting here tonight is all that church is. That this is all the body has. Many of you know that we as a church, we go on camping trips together. We play capture the flag. We meet throughout the week. We have small groups together. We have communion. We share meals. We are always with each other because we are each other's supports when the enemy is coming for us in our moments of weakness. Don't ever forget this. If you are by yourself, attach yourself to a body that you trust and that has your back. Because what's amazing is in Capture the Flag, and the Capture the Flag that we're a part of in this life, in this analogy, is that the people on your team have been baptized in the ways of the best king. Your teammates are going to be your greatest support. They are for you. They're going to fight alongside you. And in verse 30, and then in verse 34 and 35, we see Saul make another horrible mistake as he has done before. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul, and Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So we are not meant to be alone. We are not meant to be isolated as a people of God. Don't make the same mistake that I did when I was in high school. But this point, it applies both in our defense and in our offense. In Capture the Flag, has any of you ever has a teammate that just loves to go run and get captured all the time? Oh, it's the worst feeling when you have a teammate and they're refusing to take a huddle with you, and they're just sprinting out into the field, and there goes your chance of victory. So in the same way, don't go out into enemy territory by yourself. This isolation, it needs to be a tactic of defense and a tactic of offense. The second to last point I want to make is that our enemy rejoices in our failure, but our God does the opposite. In this chapter, we face somewhat of a paradox, and I'm going to try to point it out. So in verse 11, when Saul says that he's not obeying the Lord, or that he hasn't performed complete obedience, it says, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as a king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. So we learn about God here that God regrets, he regrets when we don't obey him. He regrets when we don't obey him. And then later in verse 29, we see, I'll read from 28. So Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And also the strength of Israel will not lie or relent, for he is not a man that he should relent." So in this we see a seeming paradox of God in that he can regret when somebody disobeys, but then we learn that God doesn't regret later on. How can this be? And if I want to, it's kind of hard to solve this paradox. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but we should know that we worship a God who is full of feeling and firmness. He's full of feeling and firmness. So God, he breaks when we disobey him. He does not like it. He's for us. But when he is coaching us, he doesn't relax his ways. So he feels for us, but he is firm. He is not whimsical like the enemy. He is not full of confusion. God's will is not an emotional yo-yo like many of us experience in our own lives. The last point that I hope that all of us can remember about our enemy is that our enemy is wounded. Our enemy, the serpent, has been incredibly crippled. When Jesus defeated him at the cross, he bound him. He descended into Hades and he bound him. And the odds are stacked against him because of what we have. In the conclusion of Finney's sermon in Numbers, Finney makes the point that winning begets winning and losing begets losing. How many of you, when you're playing Capture the Flag and you've captured all your enemies, how many of you are going to sit in your own territory on the defense? I hope none of you. I hope none of you will sit in the defense when you know that your enemy is wounded. If we believe that we're going to win as Christians, if we believe that we're going to defeat the enemy, this leads to a life of joy, of peace, and of life. But if we believe we're going to lose, if we believe that the enemy, we have no chance against him, this leads to confusion, conflict, and death. And not only is our enemy wounded, but we have an equally great weapon of partial obedience. We have the church. Many of us have studied different ways of changing the world, and many of us have tried different ones. But in the same way that partial obedience can make a little difference, how a little thing can make a big difference, our offensive on the world can also make a big difference. Where partial obedience can destroy us, complete obedience can change the world. After securing our defenses, do we believe this? Do we believe that we need to be on the move because our king is on the move? He's rallied everybody. And we're not supposed to be dividing into small groups and naming ourselves after. How many of you in Capture the Flag, if you've been divided on a team, how many of you divide and then name yourselves after separate team captains and then play the game by yourselves? None of us. It's not Team Finney, it's not Team Zach, it's not Team Bryant or Team Jesse. We're all following the same king. And these little things can make a big difference as we charge into the territory to set up outposts, to be on the prowl. Has anybody in here heard of Desmond Doss at all? Desmond Doss. So Desmond Doss he's a Medal of Honor recipient who was in World War II. He was one of the only he's the only non-violent Medal of Honor winner in all of American history. And there's a story it's named after the place called Hacksaw Ridge. Has anybody heard of this story, Hacksaw Ridge? So there's a great battle, and Desmond Doss is a medic. And there's a dividing line between enemy territory. And on the other side are wounded Americans and wounded Japanese. And Desmond Doss, after this great battle, he returns over and over and over into enemy territory to heal both his American soldiers and his Japanese soldiers. And a quote that people ask him after, I think he ended up saving around 75 people over the course of the night. And he said, over the course of the night, he prayed to himself, "Lord, please help me get one more. Please help me get one more." He'd return with that body. He'd go back. "Please help me get one more." He'd return. "Please help me go get one more." The lines of humanity went away from him. He saved Japanese people. He saved American people. Are all of you, do you believe that your enemy is wounded? Do you believe the same thing, that after you secure your own soul that you can be going? I want you to think about back to your baptism. Think about back to the moment where you were chosen and you were on fire and nothing was going to stop you. You're going to obey at everything. Nothing was going to get it in your way. And imagine that you're fighting an enemy that's defeated. He's crippled. Imagine that your life has a timer, that it's going to go out, that it's going to come to the end your life is going to come to the end, and that we have people on our side and we're pressing into the enemy territory after we have conquered this great conundrum of partial obedience. So I hope that as we move forward, that you would identify any ways the serpent has made its way into your life. Let us crush partial disobedience and press into enemy territory for the salvation of men. All right, thanks.